John Kabat-Zinn, the guy who wanted to try and bring this to the West and make it more available to people, decided the best way to do it is to say this is a practice that will help reduce stress. And so he called it Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. And he introduced it to hospitals, and in the hospitals that it was practiced in, they usually gave him some place in the basement to do it. That's how these things start. But then the people who participate in it started to produce interesting results, especially in a hospital setting. The people who participated in it started to stay in the hospital a less period of time when they were in the hospital. They recuperated faster from things like heart attacks. They did much better while being treated for cancer. So there started to be a lot of positive outcomes. And once that got publicized, this became something that was put into play in other hospitals because it was anything that can save money is going to be popular, right? Especially in hospitals because they're already charging 2 million% more for everything. We're here because stress reduction is a big deal these days, right? I mean, all you have to do is watch the news and then you have to recover, right? So meditation is valuable for stress reduction, and it does work to reduce stress. If you do it consistently, by sitting still and being quiet, you're creating an environment that can allow things to happen that don't normally happen. Why? Because human beings are movement animals. Human beings are thinking beings, right? They're doers. Human beings are human doers. So our whole life has been about thinking and doing, and our culture is about it. Our society is about that. Work hard, the work ethic, do more, and if it's a time when there's less money or available, do less. Do more, do less. Do something better. Do something different. These are all the ways that our society tells us work in terms of being successful in the world. And yet, while that's the case, and the Western world is the richest world, and the Western world is the most technologically advanced world that has access to the information, that has access to the latest technology and so forth. And so you would think that we have the education, we have the money, we have the answers, that we should be the healthiest country in the world, right? But it's the opposite. It's the opposite. This country is the unhealthiest country in the world. There's more mental illness in this country than anywhere else in the world. And most of it's undiagnosed. And the reason it's undiagnosed is because people either don't have the money for treatment or they're afraid to seek treatment because they don't want to be considered crazy. But if you don't want to be considered crazy and you've been divorced 3 times and you're an alcoholic or you're strung out on cocaine, then what kind of sense does that make? It just becomes crazier and crazier. So meditation is an opportunity to begin a process that can offer you a new possibility, a possibility that's outside of what you and I have been exposed to in our developmental background and being born in this wealthy, sophisticated, technologically advanced, sick country. So, and this possibility has to do with the possibility of coming to what's called an awakening, coming to an understanding that the way you and I have developed so far is still very limited, that we went to school, we learned how to talk, we learned how to read, write, we learned all the basics, but we're still pretty neurotic and have bad habits and still pretty ignorant compared to what there is to know. And so there has to be something that we're missing, or hopefully there is. If there isn't anything that we're missing, then this is as good as it's going to get. So just keep drinking that alcohol. Everything's going to be fine. Get a new TV. But it's not the case that this is as good as it's going to get. It is the case that there is a possibility that's available. And the possibility is the possibility of coming to understand that everything that you and I have learned so far as the conditioning and the education process is concerned, right, is not the end of the story. It allows us to be more sophisticated. It allows us to communicate effectively. It allows us to function at a certain level of complexity. But along with all of that comes a lot of stress and confusion and ignorance and conflict and fear, the kinds of things that we're really familiar with, if you want to be honest about it all. And so maybe there's something else. Maybe we haven't really completed our education. Maybe there's more of an education than just to learn the language and be able to talk to one another. Maybe there is another level of evolution that's possible for us as human beings that's not yet seen or recognized or as popular as it should be. A lot of the understandings relative to this possibility come from the East. The East is older than the West, and so there are traditions that go back thousands of years in the East, and there are teachings and practices that come out of those traditions that address this issue of stress and address this issue of suffering, the suffering that goes on when the life you're living is a rat race, the suffering that goes on when you can never really relax, you're never really satisfied, there's a lot of confusion, you find yourself in conflict with yourself, with the other people that you live with the society, with the world, with the politicians, just so much craziness all over the place. And maybe that's because there's something missing, something that has not yet occurred, and these experiences are kind of trying to get our attention, just like the pain in the physical body is trying to get your attention. Something's wrong that needs your attention, that needs to get fixed. Maybe the condition that we're living in the world as human beings and all of the craziness and suffering that's going on is a way of reality trying to get our attention, trying to tell us there's something missing, you're missing something here. And in the East, they tell us that that's been recognized a long time ago, thousands of years ago. It was recognized thousands of years ago, and the understandings that were necessary and the practices that were necessary to realize this possibility were established thousands of years ago, including meditation. So what is this possibility? The possibility is that maybe, just maybe, there is another level of evolution that we need to get to in order to complete the process necessary to have a good life, to experience an existence in this brief life, because life is brief, even if you live 100 years compared to all time, and given the way that we relate to time, that's not a lot of time at all. And those of you who are as old as I am know that that's the case. It's true. This is very brief. This is a visit. This is a visit. And so there's a limited amount of time here, and if you can't get your act together quick enough, it'll be over before you know it, and you won't even have gotten a clue to what this was all about. And unfortunately, that's the case for most of humanity at this point. People live and die ignorant. People live and die struggling. People live and die suffering. People live and die with the idea that the cause of the suffering is the circumstances that they find themselves in. That's the general idea, right? And therefore, our life is about improving our circumstances, right? In the East, what they say is that's a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding is one of several misunderstandings that if they don't get cleared up, if you don't come to see the truth, that you will continue to suffer and there won't be any new possibility, there won't be anything else possible. So this new understanding has to do with the idea that maybe who you have it that you are, who human beings have it that they are, maybe is a limited understanding that doesn't really capture the truth, that isn't really the whole story. Maybe you're not just the physical body, maybe you're not just the name you were given and the personality you have, maybe you're not just the story you have about yourself and about your life. Maybe there's something else that's being missed. And so in meditation, when we practice being still, it's one of the few times, if any, that a human being practices sitting still and not moving and not talking for any period of time. That when you do that, if you do it correctly, then the noise that is occurring in the mind begins to start to gradually calm down. And that's one of the reasons why the practice of meditation must be consistent. Must be consistent, because if you're just active, thinking, moving, active, and then you try and sit down and be still, all that machinery is still running, and it's very crazy making, right? It's very hard to sit still with all that going on. And the thing that people don't realize is that that's not just because you're meditating. That stuff is going on all the time, but you don't see it because you're running as fast as it is. You know, you're as busy as it is, so you can't see it until you stop. And when you stop, then you can start seeing what's going on all the time. Yeah. And this is what the neuroscientists are telling us, that the brain, we now know the brain's changing all the time. Your brain's a learning machine. It's a learning organism, right? And so however you're being and whatever you're doing is training your brain about reality all the time. So if you're not practicing being sane, you're practicing being crazy. But you're practicing something all the time, you see. And so if that's the case, and you start to pay attention, you realize that you've been practicing being crazy a long time, just like the rest of us, right? And the problem with it is that what we call normal is crazy. You wouldn't know you were practicing being crazy because everybody's crazy. We call it normal, right? Right? It's the catch-22. If you're crazy and you know you're crazy, you're not crazy. If you're crazy and everybody's crazy, nobody's crazy, right? That's called normal in our society, right? Yeah, but if you really are going to be honest about it, and if you really look to see what it feels like to be you, you'll notice that you're crazy a lot of the time and it's not comfortable. And so you have to break the habit, you have to break the process. You have to start interfering with the brain, keep repeating the same patterns, because that's what it does. It'll just keep repeating the same patterns. Haven't you noticed, right? So to get out of that, we have to sit still and start noticing what's going on. And by sitting still and paying attention to the breath, instead of staying in the constant moving thinking activity, we are now in a position to start to notice things that have been there all the time, but couldn't be seen because we're too actively involved in creating an alternative reality. Let me repeat that. This is very important. If you practice meditation consistently and you practice sitting still and moving your attention out of the thinking activity, you're practicing experiencing an alternative reality that gives you a whole different picture about what's true and real than you get when you depend on thinking for that information, right? Because when you depend on thinking for that information, all you're doing is repeating what you were given, right? When you were a kid, you were told, this is how it is, this is your name, that's your body, this is how it is, this is the world, these are other people, this is how you succeed, this is what you do to be happy. Don't worry about whether it works. So you figure, well, you know, that's the way I live my life, right? But if you're fortunate enough to come in contact with this possibility, it opens up an alternative that can produce a different way of living your life in which you can be satisfied, happy, experience peace of mind, interact with the world in a skillful way, everything you really want, really, right? So if you understand this, if you start to come to an understanding about this possibility, and you realize that you have to untrain yourself from the idea that you are things that you're actually not. What do I mean by that? Well, the root cause of human suffering is a misunderstanding about your true nature. Now, and if you come to this class or if you study these teachings, you'll hear that being said again and again and again. That's the essential problem. The essential problem is you don't know who you are. The essential problem is you don't know what you are. The essential problem is not only do you not know what you are, but you don't know what this is. So how can you have any success operating that way, that you really don't know who you are? I know you think you do, but the evidence speaks louder than that. You don't know who you are and you don't know what's really going on. And in these teachings, we call this what's going on and who you really are, the truth. That's the truth, right? And so you have been living in a version of yourself that's very limited, and it is not at all like the way you really are. And as that limited version of yourself, you have been doing your very best to be happy, satisfied, skillful in living your life, have good relationships, be healthy, and so forth and so on. Of course, if you pay attention, if you do an inventory of your life, you will discover that most of what I just said is not true. Therefore, if there's something I'm missing, I'm certainly interested in finding out what it is. Well, according to the teachings, what it is that you don't know who you are, but you're here, right? And therefore, the possibility for knowing who you are must exist because you're here. And if it's true that you don't know who you are, but you're here, right? Then it must be possible for you to find out. And if you don't know what life is, if you don't know what reality is, right, but reality is here, then it must be possible for you to find out, okay? So then that begins the process. Okay, so how do I find out? Well, you start to pay attention. That might help, right? Because the reason that paying attention the way you have in the past hasn't served you well is because it's been taken, you haven't been giving it. And you didn't know it, right? Your attention's been taken, you haven't been giving it. What's it been taken by? It's been taken by anything that shows up in your reality, right? That stimulates a desire. In other words, something that shows up that you like, get your attention, that you want, get your attention, that offers you the possibility of pleasure, get your attention. Anything that scares you, right? You get your attention so you can avoid it, right? So your life becomes a push-pull reality, right? You're either running towards something or away from something all the time, even when you're sleeping in your dreams, okay? So this is an animal life. This is an animal existence, right? Animals live that kind of a life because animals' life is about survival, isn't it? You know, not being eaten, right? So you can survive, right? But we are not living that life anymore. We're a lot more sophisticated than that. You don't have to worry about survival. That's pretty much taken care of, right? So now you're freed up, as Maslow said, because Maslow said until that essential stuff gets handled, your attention isn't available for anything. You got to find food, you got to find shelter, and all that stuff. But for most of us, that's taken care of, right? So now our attention is freed up to pay attention to other things, right? And when our attention is freed up to pay attention to other things, there are people called psychologists and commercial developers, right, that develop ways of getting your attention and creating needs that you don't have, right, so they can fulfill those needs, right? Like you didn't know that you needed to have a good cup of coffee every morning. You know, you learned that was what it was to be a person that's up to date with reality, right? And then we can sell you a good cup of coffee in the morning, and on and on and on. Yeah. You can do it in a chair. You can do it, a lot of people think that meditation has to be done with your legs like a pretzel, and you have to be suffering and all that other jazz. No. Meditation can be done anywhere, anytime, if you understand what meditation is, right? Yeah, it can be done anywhere, anytime. So, and how long do you do it, right? You start out, if you're serious about developing a practice, right? You start out doing it as long as you can tolerate the experience of doing it. If you can make it for 10 minutes, right, then you start with 10 minutes, right? But if by the end of 10 minutes you're like ready to go to the ER, don't do it for 10 minutes. Do it for 5 minutes, like that, right? And then you will, if you do it consistently, you will naturally understand that you can start to expand how much time you do it, and you'll be able to do it, right? So that's the way you approach the time. As far as the sitting is concerned, you can sit in a chair. That's very easy to do. It's good because you can keep your back straight, which is important, so that energy can move freely in the body. And you can sit in a chair. It's good because you can be comfortable in a chair, so you don't have to be distracted by the pain in your knees or the pain in your body, right? You can really do it in any position. The reason that a lot of teachers say don't do it lying down is because the brain thinks that means you're going to go to sleep, right? But if you can lie down and stay awake, right, and stay alert the whole time, that's fine. You can practice lying down. The only reason they don't say to do that is because most people fall asleep, okay?
And you can do it with music?
Yes, you can do it with music, right? The key to doing it with music is that while the music is nice in terms of an environment, creates like an environment, a quiet environment, right? But if that means that the music is taking your attention away from where you want to hold your attention, right, then that becomes an issue, okay? If the music doesn't distract you, if you can maintain, well, come on Sunday and you'll know what I mean. On Sunday, the class is upstairs in the room next to the spin class, so we have a disco next door. So you learn how to practice with music. Not necessarily soothing music, right? But I say that that's fine, that's good, because it's been my experience that the more opportunities you have to have your attention taken around you when you're practicing, and the more you can use that to hold your attention where you choose to hold it, the better. If you learn to practice meditation in a room that's quiet, where there's never any distraction or never any noise, right? Then how are you going to practice meditation anywhere but there? Because the practice of meditation, the way it was originally intended, wasn't just for stress reduction. No, it was for the practice of being able to stay conscious and awake and be out of your mind, or be aware of what's happening in your mind while you're functioning in your life, right? So that you can start to stop being crazy. So you can start to stop being crazy. What's that mean? It means so you can be aware of the fact that there's a large percentage of time that the activity in your mind that you're paying attention to is a waste of time. Anything that you don't have to give your attention to, right? Like a job that you're doing, or a sport that you're playing, or a book that you're reading, right? Anything that you don't have to pay attention to, if you pay attention, you'll notice that when you don't have to pay attention, the mind starts to wander, right? And what's it about when it's wandering? You. It's a preoccupation with you. It's a preoccupation with thinking about what you can get, what you don't want, what you do want, what you hate, what happened in the past, what you're afraid of in the future. This is just a constant, they call it the default state in neuroscience, right? And they say there's a big default state is not a good thing. You get preoccupied with yourself. You get preoccupied with yourself in relationship to everything else in the world, right? And you're trying to be safe. You're trying to protect yourself. You're trying to figure out new strategies to get more of what you want, right? Or figure out new strategies to avoid what you don't want. And you spend tremendous amount of energy doing that, when you're not engaged with something that requires your total attention, okay? And so what we're doing here is we're learning that we have to evolve. We have to come to a new level of consciousness in which we're aware that the thinking activity is not the best thing to live your life in, because the thinking activity is an interpretation of life, not life. What you think about life is not life. It's an interpretation of life. And if the life you're living is the life you're living in the world of thought, you're not living your life in the world. That's why they use the word presence when it comes to meditation. You're learning how to be present. Why? Because mostly you're not. Mostly the life you're living is in your head, right? And that's why it doesn't work. I remember distinctly at a certain point in my life being amazed at the realization that the world was not in my head. I didn't even know that I thought it was, right? And I'm telling you right now that that's probably the case for you to a large extent, that the world you're living is in your head, not out here where the real world is. And you can test it. The way you can test it is to check in with yourself. When you leave here and you're in your car driving somewhere, check in and notice what the thought activity is. And it's not going to be about being in the car driving. It's going to be about some other place, some other time that you're reviewing and planning for, remembering in your mind. And that's where you're living your life. You're not living your life in the world, you're living your life in a made-up world called thinking. So these teachings are telling us you got to come out of that world if you want to have a life. You got to learn how to be in this world, not in that world, right? And that's going to take practice, and it's going to take developing an understanding. And you've got to understand that your life depends on it. You've got to understand that unless you develop these understandings and you do these practices, you will stay in what's called a dream. The dream that's being developed in your head all the time with the thinking process. And it's not going to be a pretty picture. It doesn't go well when you live in your head, okay? And the thing about it that's important is that unless you get this in your gut and in your heart, unless you get this at a level where it's undeniable that this is true, and it's undeniable, you either get with the truth or you will continue to suffer. And the source of suffering is the expectations you have about the world that get developed in your thinking, get developed in your head, right, that are a mismatch for reality. What does that mean? It means that you keep expecting life to be different than it is, and therefore you keep being upset. That's all that's happening. You know, you're living in a make-believe world that's not consistent with the real world. And so you keep running into upset, right? Keep running into upset. This is happening all day long, by the way. If you start to pay attention, you'll notice it's happening all day long. You know, it's happening all day long in relationship to the world, other people, and even yourself. You don't even like you. You don't meet your own expectations, do you? Look in the mirror if you don't believe me. You know, we look in the mirror at something that we're trying to get to work. And it just never seems to work. And if it does, it doesn't last, right? So maybe something's wrong with that way of living your life. So you really have to get to an understanding of this that strikes you at such a level and in such a way that you realize, hey, I better find out about this. I better find out what the truth is. I better realize who I really am. I better realize what life really is so I don't miss the boat. Because this is a short visit, and if I don't get this correct before the body runs out of energy, it'll be over, and I will not have even lived this life at all. Most human beings will not live their life. Most human beings will live the life that the thinking activity in their head gives them to live, and they think that's reality. So here's the deal. If you get what I'm talking about, then you have to make an absolute commitment to practicing meditation, to try and restructure your brain, to try and come out of the illusions that you're living in, so you can start to make contact with the truth. And if you do get what I'm saying, this will land for you the way it lands for an infant that hasn't yet walked. This is a very good analogy. If you really get what I'm talking about here, you will experience it the way an infant does that sees other people walking and understands the difference, right? Why does an infant, you ever notice an infant will never give up trying to walk? You ever notice that? An infant will crawl, they'll stand up, they'll fall down, they'll crawl, they'll stand up, they'll fall down. They'll keep doing that until they can get it and they can stand up and walk, right? So it's a natural evolution, right? Because when an infant stands up and walks, they're in a different world, aren't they? They're in a different world. It changes their world. Now their world becomes a world they have access to because they can walk to it, right? The world becomes something that they can see differently because they're up here now, right? Making eye contact with other human beings, right? In the very same way, if you understand what I'm saying, your attitude about waking up will be the same as a baby's attitude about walking. And it has to be, because you will fall down. If you attempt to do this, if you attempt to meditate every day, you will fail. You did and you will. You have to fail. You have to fail because your brain has been practicing the other thing for all the years you've been alive. And for you to practice this other thing a little bit at a time, that's not going to change anything. That's a drop of blue in a sea of yellow. It's not going to change the color at all, right? So you have to do it consistently. And if you do it consistently, you'll start to get peaks. You'll start to get glimpses. You'll start to get a sense of what it might be like for you to be awake. You'll wake up in the middle of an argument with somebody and realize how crazy you are and just stop. And that wouldn't have been possible unless you had been practicing something that gave you another way of seeing what was happening. So when you practice meditation consistently, when you learn about these teachings and develop understandings about all these things, it will transform your life. It's psychotherapeutic. I'm a psychologist, so I can talk like this. It's psychotherapeutic. If you participate in meditation consistently, and if you get involved in studying these teachings, you will be in a psychotherapeutic process. You will be in therapy. And you don't have to go to a therapist. You become your own therapist, right? By paying attention to your own craziness.
Or you come here 3 times a week.
Well, you can do that too, but in your case, I'm not sure it's working. In fact, that's not true. I am sure it's working, because she happens to be the one who, whenever I ask a question, she knows the answer all the time. Right? And then at the same time, she complains about the fact that she's still asleep. Go figure.
You said you had a friend like that too. Like he knows all the books and everything.
Oh, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of professional spiritual students, you know. But that can become another egotistical state. You know, that people think that they've achieved something that makes them better than the average person because I'm spiritual. I practice meditation. That's one of the ways to find out that a teacher is not a very good teacher, if the teacher acts as if they're different than you and special. That's not the truth. Nobody's special, nobody's different, we're all exactly the same. Okay. So this is something that you have to really consider whether you want to get into this or not. If you do it half-assed, you'll suffer more than you ever did. If you do it full out, your suffering will start to gradually reduce. But you have to go through a process that will test you. You will go through confusion, you will go through failure, right? But if you're like the baby and you keep getting up, right? The time will come when you're able to walk, the time will come when you're able to meditate, and even the time will come when you're able to experience the truth of what it is to be a human being in this life. And then it becomes possible to be happy, not because you did anything to be happy, because you discovered the experience of who you really are, and that experience is happy. Not automatically, naturally happy. It's called the natural state. Any other questions? Good questions, by the way.